1.
Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar, Healthcare Identity Governance, IT Security and Compliance for the World We Live in, presented by Healthcare Innovation. My name is David Rath. I'm the Senior Editor of Healthcare Innovation. Today's program is sponsored by Imprivata, so thanks to our sponsor and to our audience for giving us your time and attention today. Before we get started, we have a few housekeeping details. To submit a question, please use the Q&A box to the left of the video window at any time. You don't have to wait until the end of the program. For technical issues, please press F5 to refresh. And if that doesn't work, you can submit a question with your issue through the Q&A panel. Finally, you can join our webinar conversation on Twitter. You can tweet using the hashtag HI Live Webinar. A PDF of the presentation is available under the Event Resource tab on your screen, as well as an Imprivata white paper on this topic. At this time, I'd like to introduce our speakers for today's program. We have Brian Selfridge and Keith Henkel from Meditology Services and Wes Wright from Imprivata. They're going to talk about some of the best practices in identity governance in healthcare settings, and then we're going to have some time at the end for a Q&A. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Brian.
Great. Thank you so much, and good day, everybody. Thank you for taking the time to be here with us today. So my name is Brian Selfridge. I am a partner with a company called Meditology Services that provides healthcare cybersecurity advisory services, specifically for the healthcare industry, serving providers, payers, business associates, and others. We'll tell you more about Meditology in a moment, just to give you a little context for the discussion today. But my background is I serve for the federal government in a few capacities as a HIPAA expert witness for the Office for Civil Rights. Also do some advisory work with the Office of National Coordinator and Department of Health and Human Services on healthcare security stuff. And prior to my roles here, I spent time as a Chief Information Security Officer of a large health system in the Northeast U.S. And before that, started my career with PricewaterhouseCoopers and their security consulting division. So that's enough about me. I'll turn it over to Keith to introduce himself as well.
Thanks, Brian. My name is Keith Henkel, also with Meditology Services. I've been working in the healthcare space for about 15 years now. Before that, I was a client and a former CISO working at some healthcare systems, and got my start in IT security operations. So started on the IT side of things, and then made the jump over to healthcare information security. I'll pass that on to Wes. Wes, I think you're on mute.
Yep. Thank you, Keith. Rookie mistake. Hey, good morning or good afternoon. Good morning to my West Coast friends. My name is Wes Wright. I'm the Chief Technology Officer at Imprivata. Prior to that, I spent about 25 years on the provider side of the healthcare delivery organizations, much like Brian and Keith have done. So here's our agenda for today. We're going to talk about some of the identity and access management business drivers, some of the unique challenges that we face in healthcare, and some of the great governance practices that Meditology has discovered throughout their consultations. And then I'll just give you a brief overview of Imprivata's identity governance capabilities. But first, a little bit about Imprivata. You know, most people know Imprivata as the tap and go company, the either TITO, tap in, tap out, or the BIBO, badge in, badge out company. But you know, over the last 2 or 3 years, we have really developed what we think is one of the best and most complete identity and access management suite of tools in the business. We're in over 60% of the hospitals, have about 8 million clinical identities, and on about 3.5 million clinical workspaces, most of them shared clinical workspaces. Something we're really proud of is our Net Promoter Score, which is 54, which to give you some context, Apple's in the 30s and Microsoft's in the 20s, so we're pretty proud of that. And it tells you a lot about the customers that we have and the partnerships that we've managed to make with those folks. Now, I'll turn it over to you, Brian, to tell us a little bit about who Meditology is.
Great. Thanks so much, Wes. So I'll be brief on this. I want to give you a little bit of context about Meditology and how our perspective on identity and access management and governance is informed by our experience. So we work with hundreds of healthcare entities across the country. Many of our team members are ex-security and privacy officers or currently serving in virtual capacity for healthcare entities. We work with providers, we work with payers, we work with business associates and other firms. So if it's got PHI and has requirements to protect access control and otherwise around that information, then that's our niche. And we're pleased to have been ranked as a top advisory firm by the class organization as the #1 ranked firm for the last couple of years in a row, just to give you some context of how we sort of stack up in this space. So part of that perspective that we have informing our discussion today is from a couple different angles. One, we do things like ethical hacking and penetration testing, for example, where we see the impacts of improperly secured access controls and monitoring and all the like, and the way in which bad guys and simulated bad guys can use that information to their advantage to end up breaching environments and otherwise gaining unauthorized access. So there's that side of the coin. But we also look at it from a regulatory perspective. So the HIPAA security rule, the core requirements around access and administrative controls relative to identities is a core component, and we'll talk about in a moment how that's played out with resolutions and breaches and everything else. There's also a clinical patient safety aspect to this. So we'll do medical device security, for example, and understanding that lapses in access controls are not just a regulatory data sensitivity breach type issue, which of course they are, but also can have tangible impacts to patient safety when not managed properly and devices become inaccessible or otherwise damaged. So there's a couple different angles that we look at this from, and we'll talk about those as we go, but that's enough about us. I just want to let you know sort of where we're coming from with this stuff. So for the
Brian,
formal agenda
I was just going to say, I took advantage of Meditology Services back when I was on the provider side of the organization. You guys do great work, I have to say.
Thank you so much, Wes. We enjoyed that process for sure. Sorry to see you come to the dark side here. So in terms of the agenda today, well, as was mentioned at the outset, I really want to talk a little bit up front about the context. So what are some of the business drivers for getting identity and access management right? And what are some of the challenges? And healthcare is special, and which we really are. We like to think we're special, but we actually are. And the complexities we deal with getting identity right. And then we'll spend some time not just highlighting those, but talking about ways in which entities, including Wes's former organization and others, have successfully managed to put identity and access management controls in place. What do those look like? What are some of the leading practices? And then we'll talk about the ways to automate and support that through Imprivata and otherwise. So a lot of good stuff to cover today. So we'll get moving through it, and also looking forward to any questions you all have as we go. So let's start with some of the business drivers. Certainly regulatory and compliance and audit compliance are top of mind. They're always the ground level foundation for any information security program. So we have the HIPAA security rule, we have related OCR enforcement, which we'll dive into a little bit more granularity, but there's also a number of state regulations that are mandating information security access control as well as privacy controls related to monitoring who has access and the appropriateness of that access, not only within individual organizations, but across states and geographies and everything else. So California and others are doing some really groundbreaking regulations, and that seems to be mushrooming into other geographies. So regulatory compliance is always top of mind, something we have to sort of meet that low watermark. But it's evolved. It's been interesting to watch identity stay at the top of the priority list for the last 15, 20 years. And, initially it was about regulatory HIPAA stuff and compliance. And then it evolved into more, okay, we're having a lot of breaches. We're feeling the pain of the reputational damage, the fines, all the bad outcomes that happen when we do have breach events. And as that has escalated over the years, organizations are starting to pay more attention to access management just because we want to avoid that particular pain. And we've also seen access management being a critical component to enabling trust between organizations, particularly between healthcare organizations and third parties, for example, that need to show that access controls are being put in place consistently when large volumes of patient information are going to be shared. So you see high trust, common security framework, and SOC 2 certifications having major portions of those certification requirements requiring access controls and the like to be in place in order to demonstrate that trust. And then what I find really fascinating about access controls as compared to other security domains and things that we need to worry about in this space, identity and access has, I think, one of the most broad impacts to the business, the core business itself, in terms of both clinical effectiveness. So the impact to a physician, a clinician, a frontline worker, especially in COVID and everything else, the last thing we need is any disruption to the ability for clinicians to provide effective, safe, efficient care at the bedside, at the point of care, during a pandemic or otherwise. And a lot of times information security and access controls can introduce hurdles and workflow issues that really have a major impact on their ability to do that. And from a financial and operational perspective, getting access management wrong or not optimizing it has very real financial impacts, especially as we'll talk about later around manual processes and the time and cost and effort it takes to provision access, deprovision it, report on it. All these things, if done inefficiently, can be real dollar impacts and time impacts to organizations. And then patients are having more access than ever before to their information. It used to be just, all managed within the health system, and records management would release what they needed to the patients, but now patients have near real-time access to their information, patient portals, and we've got to get access controls right so that they can get to the information when they need it to provide the information they need for themselves and their families. So a lot of good reasons to get this figured out. And if there weren't enough reasons, I'll just very briefly highlight a couple trends with respect to enforcement and breach activity. On the enforcement side with OCR, I won't go line by line through these, don't worry, but there's definitely some key themes. If we look at the enforcement and fines from the last year, where many of the resolution agreements coming down on providers are citing rights of access, access control, access issues that have been either in part or entirely focused on the resolution agreement on access controls. So often it's not even just the source issue or the breach that leads OCR to get in, and that may be related to an access control issue, it may not, but other times it might just be a contributing factor or a root cause that once the regulators get in digging, they end up finding out that access controls are deficient and the organization has not been complying with HIPAA, core HIPAA requirements around the same. So, we see 15.3 million last year, and prior years we saw 16 million alone just with Anthem. So the numbers are very real, and also it's not just about the fine itself, but those that have had to go through the resolution agreements, multi-year situations with the federal regulators know that the cost is much more expensive to maintain the compliance that's necessary over that time to get caught up, to get compliant, to report that back to the federal government, spend lots of money getting caught up. So very expensive endeavor if not handled correctly. And then if we look at the breach data itself as well, and breaches don't always lead to regulatory enforcement, sometimes they do, but we look at last year alone and seeing 42 million patient records as reported to the Department of Health and Human Services. This is just per the breach notification rule, what's been reported up. Understandably, there may even be sort of more records than that going underreported in some cases. But we look at the themes there, again, access control issues, access to email, access to user accounts, phishing, providing user credentials, things that all in a properly run identity and access management program would have a very reduced likelihood of happening. So not entirely eliminated, unfortunately, but reduced. So we see this theme in enforcement. We see it with breaches, and there's a lot of good reason for us to get a handle on this. So with that, I'll let Wes talk a little bit more about his experience.
Yeah, I was just, thanks, Brian. I was just reflecting the two different ways to look at this. I've got the CTO hat on when I'm looking at the identity and access management stuff, and you've got the CISO, and the CISO's kind of charged with telling you the bad things that'll happen to you. And in order for me to sell an identity governance system, I have to tell people the potential positive outcomes of it. And there is a bunch of positive that comes out of having a really good identity governance system in place. There's usually a tremendous FTE free up. I know at some of my previous locations, we didn't have an identity governance system, an automated identity governance system in place, and so I had to, brute force the governance pieces and the provisioning and deprovisioning, and I'd, inevitably miss a deprovision somewhere, and that'd get me in front of the board when I didn't really want to be in front of the board. The ROI on that first day ready is something that can't be undermined, not just from a money perspective, but from a reputational perspective. When you get a new clinician that comes on board and he or she isn't ready to go, their applications aren't ready to go, they can't tap in, it just, one, it frustrates them, and two, it just causes a lot of reputational damage to the health IT function of that organization, and that's not what you need. So there are a lot, while Brian went over a lot of the negative ramifications for not having a good automated identity governance and access system in place, there are a lot of positive ROI instances out there as well. So I'll turn it back over to you, Brian, and let you walk through the rest of the agenda here.
Thanks, Wes. We needed some positivity with all this corona and everything else, everything's doom and gloom. We need
there
the sunny side, so thank you for that perspective.
Yeah.
But a little more doom and gloom, just one more dose before we get into actually solving this thing. So let's talk a little bit about some of the challenges. Why is healthcare unique? Why is this so difficult? And it really is difficult. And so it's easy for consultants and the people to come in and say, hey, just go and get your provisioning right, get your deprovisioning right. What's the big deal? Well, it is a big deal. And so here's some of the reasons why, and many of you, I'm sure, are living this. But just the sheer complexity of our healthcare ecosystem, from the disparate departments and functions, from various inpatient systems, radiology, all the different departments that have all their different systems, applications and locations, all the way to outpatient settings and different geographical locations, that the sheer volume of applications we need to deal with is just tremendous. Hundreds to thousands of applications for a typical provider to manage across a wide array of devices, from mobile to workstations to servers to in-home patient devices, right? The data is everywhere. Cloud environments are just going wild, and that handoff to third parties and saying, okay, we're going to hand you our data, and that conversation about the access controls that need to go on across, again, hundreds and thousands of applications and cloud-hosted environments in many cases, is very, very difficult to manage. This is not something that you can manage with a spreadsheet somewhere and keep track of where everything is and what your controls look like. It gets very, very complicated very fast. And, we have highly regulated data everywhere. Some other industries, like, I'm not going to pick on any because they'll all get upset with me, but some of the industries have a handful of core systems, and the sensitive crown jewel data that lives in a couple different places, and you can put lots of controls and monitoring around them. With us, it's patient information, and it's everywhere. It's pervasive. And that makes our challenge of controlling the access even that much more difficult. And Wes, I won't put you on the spot, but I would imagine you probably had quite a few applications in your prior role to deal with and keep an eye on.
Yeah, it was. I wish I could say it was in the hundreds, or even in the thousands. But most places is in the tens of thousands of applications. So yeah, as you said, PHI is spread in a lot of different areas within an organization, and identity governance and saying who has access to what is one of the major ways we can get control of that.
Exactly, and there's no easy button. We're going to help you with push some buttons here, hopefully good ones. But there's no simple silver bullet here. But you know, that pervasiveness across these disparate systems, across these applications, makes our challenge that much more difficult. And some of the user groups that we didn't mention, things like researchers, data analytics, administrative functions, above and beyond just the clinical need to access information from nurses and doctors and everybody else that's doing the good work out there. There's been a growing number of use cases where that data needs to be replicated and replicated and replicated for different purposes. And very often, the access controls and the minimum data sets that are used are not optimally managed, to say the least. And so we have this increased footprint of information where anytime you have more information across different locations and different people with access to it, there's going to be opportunities for misuse of that information. So, so just again, speaking to this sheer sort of complexity. Now, some of the exposures, if we look at sort of what does that mean in terms of actual risk exposure, that complexity, some of the themes that bubble up for us, not only now, but I think over the years consistently, have been challenges for governance, for managing who has access to what and when. And some of that is defining the business rules and the role-based access of who should have access and when, what are the boundaries, and just getting consensus on that, not only within the proverbial four walls of the health system, for example, but also as that information goes across those different ecosystems and third parties and clouds and devices, and making sure that those business rules get communicated downstream and implemented effectively becomes really, really tricky. And the approvals and making sure that, as new access is created, that we're getting away from old habits of, just creating overly broad access that is created like other users that have existed, or allowing identity access and permissions to accumulate over time, whereas people move around within the organization, they may be snowballing their rights, access rights, rather than sort of taking things away when they no longer need it. So that's creating a lot of challenges, as well as just the manual processes. And we'll keep coming back to this, and I think this is going to be a big Imprivata, discussion point, is when you have this type of scale, and you still have folks pointing and clicking in Active Directory and individual applications to create new accounts or change access or deprovision accounts, we just can't keep up. There aren't enough human beings to really keep up with it in an effective way. So those manual processes are creating a lot of exposure, both financially, but as well as just from a risk perspective of things that are getting missed. As well as just reporting on our compliance and what are we doing, what processes do we have in place. That all takes time. Document our procedures, communicate it to auditors and everything else. And sometimes those gaps can create exposures as well. And when we look at the COVID situation in particular, there's a lot of changes. And by the way, Wes has a great blog out on this, so I'll give a plug for that, where he talks about some of the changing models. But things like the sort of carte blanche release of remote access to the majority of the workforce, where maybe a very small subset used to have remote access, and now so many players, for very good reasons, have access to this information, which is great. We've been able to pivot, been able to allow the organizations to continue and healthcare to survive and do what we need to do. But at some point, we're going to need to scale back those access rights, and these exceptions that we've put in place for remote access, for perhaps furloughed employees, or people that have temporary changes to their access or changes to their roles, where they may no longer be doing their core job, and they get, they might have been outpatient work, and now they're focused on helping the ICU or helping other areas, and their access needs to change. How do we roll that back over time will be really challenging, and tracking and managing those exceptions is really important right now to make sure that we can prepare going forward. All right, and then the last piece that I'll mention here before turning it back to Wes to keep going here is some of the other exposures around just the traditional single sign-on issues. I mean, it's amazing that this issue persists, but it does, where we have so many disparate systems and applications, and expecting clinicians and physicians and others to be logging into 100 different things and impacting their workflow and ability to just focus on patient care still remains a very real impact, not only from a security exposure, but just from a business context perspective. And we're still seeing a lot of single-factor authentication, single username and password. There's a big uptick in remote access attacks over remote desktop protocol, for example. Not to get too technical on everybody, but there's a big uptick in that because single-factor authentication is easy to break, and the bad guys know it, and they know everybody's working remotely, so those attacks are coming hard and heavy right now. So that's been an issue over time, but it's more prominent in these last few months in particular, as well as the people with the keys to the kingdom, the privileged access, not having sufficient controls and monitoring around making sure that when you have access to everything, that your account has extra protections around it. And then the final thing I'll point out here is the cloud security piece, where we could do an entire session on cloud access and cloud security, and in fact, I think we're going to do a webinar next month on this, so stay tuned. But so much of that handoff to third parties, it's not enough just to say, okay, you have our data now, make sure to control access. It has to be a conversation. Those rules need to be communicated so that we don't end up in situations with third-party breaches and third-party risk issues as well. So with that, I'll kick it over to Wes here to maybe talk less about doom and gloom as well, and help us figure out how you guys fix all this stuff for us.
Yeah. When we went, by the way, I'm glad that there's still this SSO problem out in healthcare, because that's one of our major businesses, as most people know. And we're still, the surprising thing is Imprivata is one of the most well-known single sign-on applications out in healthcare. We're only in 60% of healthcare, so it does remain a problem. But when we're going over these slides together, I was struck by how both Meditology and Imprivata think about identity. It used to be back in the day when I started out on the health delivery organization, over here on the left-hand side of the slide, it was easy. Clinicians came into the hospital, they hit workstations, and usually hooked up to a thick client app to get to the EHR. But it's not like that anymore. Now you have these multiple users and roles out there. They're going, trying to work from, especially nowadays, multiple different locations using all kinds of different devices and accessing all kinds of different apps that are both on-prem, off-prem, and some hybrid apps. And the one thing that ties them all together is digital identity. And with a digital identity, you've got to have a good identity governance system. It's enough that digital identity, Brian, I don't know if you heard this before or not, but 5 or 6 years ago, I started to hear from the CISO community more than anybody that identity is the new perimeter, because we've punched holes in the old perimeter so much with the SaaS apps and mobile apps and different devices that the identity is the new perimeter. But right now at Imprivata, we think it's actually more than that. It's not just the new perimeter, it's the new control plane. It's how you determine who gets access to what, almost more importantly from a HIPAA perspective, should they have access to it? And if they should have access to it, who gave them access to it? And without a strong identity governance program in place, your identity, which is the new control plane, isn't controlling much of anything. So now I think I'll turn it back over to Keith, and he can take us on from here.
Thanks, Wes. So we talked about some of the business complexities and some of the challenges and reasons why you would want to have an identity governance program. So let's cover some of the leading practices we see in some of the successful programs out there, so you guys can learn from what other folks have done. So one of the key things that we've spotted and super critical is that you plan for an identity governance program, an identity access management program. Don't just drop a device or system or application into your environment. Get it set up, do your initial go live, and then kind of put it in the back of your radar. You really want to have some sort of a process where you're having continuous deployment of new use cases, new roles, and stuff like that. And the organizations that did that had a much better COVID response, right? As everybody was trying to grapple with quickly deploying new applications, moving things into the cloud, dealing with folks connecting in from new locations. It really helps if you have that game plan at a program and you've assigned the right roles and responsibilities so that everybody works on the same page and can tackle the new problems in a much more controlled manner. It's also extremely important to have some sort of an SDLC, some sort of a process by which you have consistency on how you're deploying new use cases, new roles, new privileges, new automation. Have a game plan and then be consistent with it. It really doesn't matter which particular life cycle you use. Some are probably faster than others, but just pick one and be consistent with it. It'll really help you build that momentum so that when new things do come, and we all know that businesses are constantly changing and business requirements and objectives are constantly changing, so you never know when the next item that's going to get dropped in your lap. It may not be as big as our COVID response, but there's always going to be something. And then probably the key part here is make sure you build a governance work group. Get some folks, representation from all different areas, get your different stakeholders in there. Make sure that they understand what the objectives are of the program, and then get their input and their feedback to help you get the prioritization right, so you know what things are going to give you the most bang for your buck. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in some of the upcoming slides, but it's really key to make sure that the folks that are going to be using it, your end users, have at least some say in your governance program. The folks that are going to be managing in different areas and approving who has access to what, they should have a voice. The folks that are going to be deploying the use cases, the IT security operation folks, the IT people, they should also have a voice. And of course, your business leaders need to have a voice as well. So make sure you take time to define your roles and responsibilities for the program as a whole, not just the folks that are going to be using the systems, but the folks that are going to be helping you design, define, deploy, and really get your rule sets out there and your automation out there. If you do a little bit of work up front, it makes it a lot easier. There won't be a lot of surprises. People won't know, won't be opposed to doing the things that need to get done. Also, make sure you communicate well. Make sure you have a communications plan or a plan to routinely communicate with the different stakeholder groups. You really do not want to put any surprises out to the business. They get really, they become much less efficient if things are different than what they're used to. They don't mind change, but they do like consistency. So if you have a consistent method for communicating that change and you make them comfortable with it, you'll be much more successful if you include them in that aspects. Also be prepared to conduct and coordinate with regular risk assessments, right? This is now going to be a key cornerstone of your security program. You do want to make sure that you conduct regular risk assessments of both your identity governance program and then the wider components of that. And make sure that you coordinate with any other risk assessments that are going on, whether they're the traditional ones that healthcare organizations are doing on an annual basis, or pen tests or smaller risk assessments for key components. Make sure that you have a process by which you can both coordinate with those folks and then track anything that you need to make changes on. And Wes, I know you commented earlier on our taking over this particular graphic. We couldn't resist it, but wanted to pass it off to you if there's anything in there that I didn't cover.
Oh yeah, I was gonna break in and comment. Hey, I love this slide for two reasons. It's titled IAM Governance Leading Practices, and the graphic that y'all put in the middle of it is an Imprivata graphic. And I think it illustrates really. We've been talking about identity governance, but on this slide we're talking about identity and access management, the whole program. And if you'll remember those 4 quadrants I talked about before, with the users, devices, or actually users, locations, devices, and apps, you'll see that surrounds that box that has the major components of an identity and access management system inside of them, and that's the provisioning, deprovisioning, the access management, the single sign-on that Brian talked about earlier, as well as the multi-factor authentication. and with the Imprivata products, because every one of those pieces and parts are integrated with the other, you get this underlying foundation of governance and compliance. So we really like this graphic at Imprivata, and I'm really happy that you guys put it in there for us, Keith.
Yeah, we really like it also. It's very succinct. I like how everything's in there. It keeps it all nice and clean.
Yep.
All right, so one of the key things that you're going to have to do when you're deploying any new identity governance system is really sit down and have a formal process for prioritizing what you're going to do so that you know what your quick wins are going to be. You also know where your biggest returns are going to be. Right, so in this particular example here, we took stakeholder input from both the legal leadership, the compliance teams, the IT teams. Not included in there, but probably should be included in there are some of the business function. I guess they're included under leadership, but also some of your users, right? You want to make sure that you have representations from some of the folks that are going to be using it. We found if you do that and you use a great tool like some of the ones that come from Imprivata, you actually get a lot more buy-in from the community as well. Make sure you take some of your past experiences in there, anything that you've done in the near term or longer term past. Look at some of the details that Brian mentioned earlier about the OCR and some of the breach reports. Take a look at your existing incidents that you've had in your organization. Also talk to other organizations, whether in through some of the information sharing communities or your local geographical regions. Take that information, throw that in there as well. Make sure you have a good set of group and role definitions. Make sure you understand the folks that you're going to be trying to provision. Talk to the business. Make sure you understand what they do, when they do it, and how they do it, so that you can ensure to include that in any of the plans that you put in there. And you can take all of that and you can map it against multiple different methods. What we did here is we really took a look at two different aspects of it. The complexity, how hard is it for us to actually go ahead and deploy a good use case for that? And then what is the risk of that particular role? Are they a high-risk role, somebody that deals with a lot of PHI or a lot of other information that if it got out there would be really important or really damaging to the organization? And then you just plot it on those two graphs, and you're really going to look for your quick wins are going to come from the high-risk, low complexity, that key corner. You may also get some low-risk, low complexity in there in your quick wins, right? Because they're things that are not so hard to do, but things that will give you maybe not as much of a return, but certainly will help. They can also help you build your confidence. And then, of course, you'll then want to tackle your high-risk, high-complexity ones, and then eventually move to your low-risk, high-complexity. And this gives you the ability to go ahead and say, we're going to focus on these particular use cases before the others, and it'll help you keep on track to make sure that you consistently keep adding in the things that benefit the organization the most. So some of the key things that you've heard, or key themes that you've heard here is identity access management and identity governance are really helping you to automate your processes, right? It'll help you build out your consistency, which is things that everybody likes for the most part. And it'll also help you to return some of those employees or full-time resources from some tasks that are probably low value to the organization, right? Checking checkboxes, clicking buttons, and stuff like that, and allow you to take them and repurpose them to other tasks. Whether it's other tasks here helping you in the identity governance function, either to help you build out new tools or things like that, or maybe returning to some of the other business functions that you need to do, providing additional value that you may not have been able to do without having automation in there. So it's key when you're automating to make sure you take the crawl, walk, run type of approach, right? Define what you're trying to do, build little steps into the process, get it to the point where maybe you provision, you automate provisioning, then maybe you automate provisioning plus deprovisioning. Then you go ahead and put single sign-on in there. Then you go ahead and make sure that you put multi-factor authentication on key people. Get those items in there, but definitely get away from your manual processes. You do not want to be building manual processes in here into a tool that's automate things. As we talked about earlier, once you've identified your quick wins, go ahead and deliver them. And try to get them in the first go-rounds. Make sure you deprovision, for example, dormant accounts. Get that out there quickly. And then as you deploy additional roles and additional functionality, those things will have built that foundation, both to build your confidence, but also to go ahead and be available to new roles as they're out there. If you automatically deprovision when somebody's removed from one role, it should apply to all new roles that were built out in the interim. And then make sure you focus not just on your on-prem stuff or just your cloud access. Work to get the same processes across all functions. We're all working on on-prem solutions and on cloud solutions, and applications are moving around everywhere all day. Make sure that you have the same consistent rule sets and same consistent workflows, regardless of what platform you're on. Okay. So one other key thing that we want to cover is the organizations that do the best are the ones that sit down and organize what they're going to measure and then take the actions based on what they're measuring. So really want to make sure that you're keying your identity governance functions into your strategic objectives, making sure you meet your business objectives, right? So one of your strategic objectives may be to give right access to the right folks at the right times, right? That's traditional for identity and access management. Tie that into some of the performance indicators that you have on your program. Make sure you sit down and measure out each of those three things, making sure that you have the right roles defined, right? The right level of access. Make sure that you have your time periods, locations, and stuff like that, the right times are defined. That's at your operational level. Don't just measure, hey, we've deployed 5 new use cases, but measure the things that matter. And then last but not least, if you do need to measure things like how many use cases you put out there, that's really at the development level. You're going to be using this as a continual process, continual improvement process. You're always going to be deploying new functionality in the tool. Make sure you have some metrics and indicators out there to make sure that you're continuing to make progress, you're continuing to improve both how the governance program functions, but also how the technology is getting that insight that you're getting from your governance team all the way back into the tools that you use. We're coming towards the end of my slides here. I want to make sure I covered this one as well. Cloud is really, especially now with everybody working from home, there's a lot of the objections that have been out there to cloud have been eliminated over the last 5 to 10 years. And so identity access management and your governance program really do need to make sure that you take advantage of all the functionality in the tools to allow you to deploy cloud safely, cleanly, quickly. And some of the tools that you can use to do that include making sure that you have the right service control policies out there to secure your users, your groups, your roles. Both, again, reusing a lot of the roles and functionality you've already built out, either in your on-prem solution or in your hybrid solution. Apply those restrictions to who can create user roles and groups too. Make sure if you're going to delegate that out to business users, make sure they understand how it works, why it works, and follow all of your traditional processes. And then last but not least, make sure that you implement the cloud provider's guardrails, and that includes making sure you have continuous identity access management assessments on your user roles, groups, and permissions, and so on and so forth. So at this point, I'm going to pass it back to, I believe, to Wes, and he'll take you through some of the capabilities.
Yeah, hey, thanks, Keith. That was really neat. And again, I particularly appreciate you putting that Imprivata graphic in one of your leading practices slides there. So, because Keith was just talking about the cloud aspect of identity governance, I figured I'd throw this slide up first, and that's the Imprivata identity governance with Azure. A lot of folks may or may not know, but we announced a pretty significant partnership with Microsoft about a year and a half ago this time. It started out with our single sign-on product, and now our most recent announcement has been the availability of our identity governance product to be run out of Azure, and a very significant integration with Azure. And I'm not going to walk you through this slide. We're getting a little close on time. Because I'd rather walk you through our base identity governance product. And you can see that our identity governance product covers all the bases that Keith and Brian were talking about. one of the things that I'm particularly proud of, having tried to stand up some identity governance products in my previous life in the health care delivery organizations, is the speed at which Imprivata is capable of giving you an automated identity governance system. I think Brian and Keith will attest that most of these identity governance projects last years. They take years and cost thousands of lives. Well, maybe not. Maybe there's a little hyperbole there, but they do take years. And I'm proud that at Imprivata we've realized that that's one of the major stumbling blocks in people standing up an identity governance solution, because it's hard work, and frankly, it's kind of like plumbing. Everybody knows it needs to be there, but nobody gets patted on the back for putting one in. So we have really honed our processes, and with the integration, remember that one slide, with the integration of OneSign data with our identity governance product, we can get most organizations up and running with 5 applications, including their EHR, and usually Active Directory, Exchange Online, and a couple other apps that the customer identifies within 5 to 6 months, which is extraordinary in the identity governance world. And so that's one of the things I'm most proud about, because you can buy the software, but if you can't get it implemented, it's just a waste of money. And second to that is our governance and compliance, our GRC, governance, risk, and compliance module. All Imprivata does is healthcare. So our governance, risk, and compliance reporting module, we are pretty proud in the fact that pretty much every report a healthcare organization would have to do is straight out of the box, capable out of our identity governance system. I would have given a lot of money for our user attestation or periodic access review module that comes with identity governance at some of my other locations, because that was always such tremendous work to get done on a quarterly basis. So rightly so, since I work at Imprivata, I really do believe that Imprivata's identity governance system is probably, let's take away probably, is the best identity governance system available for healthcare, especially when you combine it with the Microsoft partnership that we have going in our identity governance space. And I think now, David, we're going to turn it back over to you for questions.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Wes. And we do have some good questions. The first, and you guys can take your turns at who wants to answer these. But the first one is, are IAM governance and data governance related to each other? And the second part of the question is, what's the typical organizational structure, roles, and responsibilities for IAM?
Okay,
I can take this, David. Go ahead, Wes. All yours.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm from a very, very peripheral, high-level view. They didn't used to be. It used to be identity and access management were separate functions from your data governance place. But more and more, the more C-level execs that I talk to at healthcare organizations, they're starting to combine those. And if you think about it, it really makes sense, because through your identity and access management program, you're actually allocating who has access to what data. So yeah, it didn't used to be that those two were intertwined, but now I'm starting to see people connect the two. And Brian, you and Keith, I'm sure with your consulting advisors on, can probably give a much more in-depth answer to that.
No, I think we'll be right aligned with you, Wes. So we had a very similar experience. So, you need them both, right? You need data governance, you need identity and access management governance. The way I sort of viewed it, data governance has finally started to come into its own over the last couple of years. That even wasn't even around for the longest time. But I see identity and access management in some ways as a subset of data governance, where data governance is looking at, where's my information going, right? Who are we sharing it to? And let's put some guardrails around that. What data is being shared, how much of it, what types of data, how sensitive, and then who needs access. So if you don't answer those questions and you don't have the identity as the piece of that, and rolling up and having some cohesive communication between those different functions, then I think you're missing the boat. So absolutely, I think it's a great question, by the way, and one that we need to continue to have that conversation of how those two can complement each other.
I agree.
Okay, the next question is, now, do the speakers endorse single sign-on, or would it be better to go back to the better practice to go back to having a sign-on to different devices, apps, etc.?
Well, I think, Brian, I think I'm going to take this one first. Imprivata wholly endorses single sign-on. I say that jokingly. Imprivata, again, as I said at the beginning of the presentation, that's how we made our name, is with our access management single sign-on product called OneSign. But it's not only that reason we endorse single sign-on. It's through single sign-on that you can get to a near passwordless environment, one. And two, from a clinical perspective, we just cannot ask our clinicians to have to remember or even have to input multiple usernames and passwords into the application. So, no, I don't think there's any way we would ever back off of a single sign-on environment.
Yeah, we can't go backwards. There's no question. Wes, I agree with you 100%. I mean, access control, both in terms of, like you said, the actual act of accessing as well as remembering passwords, that stuff's got to become transparent to the end users, to the clinicians. They shouldn't have to think about it. They shouldn't have to deal with it. Once it's set up, it should be seamless. And I think SSO is one of the best technologies out there that makes that happen realistically. And we got to keep charging down that path and finding innovative ways, in addition to single sign-on, to continue that story.
Okay. You guys mentioned COVID a couple of times in the presentation, and one of the questions is asking if you could maybe give more examples or more detail about the impacts of COVID on healthcare customers in terms of identity governance, either maybe having to give existing healthcare workers access to new systems if they're moved to different roles, for instance.
Yeah, I'll start again, Brian. I'm sorry for being the first out of the blocks on this, but this one, this was a softball. I've actually done, myself and Dr. Sean Kelly, who's our chief medical officer and a practicing ER physician in Boston, have done a couple of webinars actually on how our customers have found some really unique, innovative ways to use Imprivata software for help in some aspects of the COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic here. You can find those at imprivata.com/COVID-19. But we've got, I think our last total on that was somewhere around 25, 26 different use cases on how our clever customers have figured out how to use Imprivata solutions to help them in their battle with COVID.
Yeah, and this is Brian. I would add to that, absolutely there's use cases, absolutely there's places where automation and governance is just critical right now, with organizations provisioning and deprovisioning access and moving people around, changing access. Again, doing that manually in the middle of all this is just a nightmare for those that are trying to manage that, as well as just keeping track of what was changed. We added this rights, we changed that, we made exceptions, we have furloughed employees, we have all this stuff to track. Having a tool where you can have an audit trail and a way to say, okay, now I see when we did this, when we made that decision, and be able to backtrack that over time is just essential. So there's countless examples of where having a capability pre-COVID is really allowing the COVID situation to be more manageable, I think, from an identity perspective in many ways.
Okay.
Yeah, and exactly what you talk about there, Brian. I wrote a blog. The title was, "Dang, wish I would have had an automated identity government administration system." And it was mostly in reference to the COVID crisis, because it is those moves, adds, and changes that if you didn't have some kind of system in place, you will end up saying, dang, I wish I would have had one.
Okay. Another question is, so these IAM challenges seem well understood. Does that mean that more health organizations are buying and implementing commercial solutions for this? If you had to give a percentage of organizations that have truly implemented an identity governance solution, what would you guess?
Well, Wes, you've got your 60% number to start, right? So we know we got at least more than half.
Well, that 60% was for the single sign-on aspect of that, and I wish we had 60% of the identity governance market too, but I think it's significantly less than that. I've talked to a lot of CXOs out there, and you know, they're Brian. I mean, you guys talk to them as well, but I'd be surprised if 10% of the health delivery organizations out there had a well-oiled identity governance access management system in place. I say well-oiled. I think about 40% of the health delivery organizations out there have a software package that they haven't been able to stand up yet. And the remaining 60% have a spreadsheet, brute force, FTE, homegrown system that they use. That's just kind of Kentucky windage.
Yeah, I think 10% is generous. The industry is really still behind. I remember deploying this stuff at large enterprises. This is 15, 20 years ago. I mentioned in my bio, I was with Pricewaterhouse. I used to do this work exclusively on identity and access management deployments. And then it was just a handful of big organizations doing it. Here we are 15, 20 years later, and we still, particularly in healthcare, are just behind in getting the automation in place. Part of it is due to the complexity and just oh my gosh, how am I gonna even begin to deal with that and automate that and put it into a system? And so I'll just stick with my homegrown process, my good enough process. But unfortunately,
right.
those manual things are not good enough anymore.
Yeah, and I really think, Brian, and you can agree or disagree, but I really think that this crisis that we're going through right now, with all those moves, adds, and changes, with the surges, you're getting CIOs, CISOs, and CTOs lifting their heads up and go, I don't know what happened with all of those people we just moved around. I don't know how to unwind it. I don't know who has access to what. And I think this might finally be that catalytic moment that folks actually put the stake in the ground and say, no, by God, I'm not going to push my identity governance out to next year. I need to have it now.
Okay, guys, I think we have time for just one more question, and here it is. For CISOs, what is most meaningful to them in terms of ROI for an identity governance solution?
I can take this first, Wes, if you like. You can jump in. So, I think there's really three major areas for return on investment. The good news is making a case for identity governance is so much easier than a lot of other security tools and capabilities, because there is a couple different areas that hits. One, you get your operational efficiency. This isn't just a security win. This is an operational cost-saving, business function, clinically facing, whatever you want to put on it. This impacts the business in a very positive way. Back to Wes's slide earlier, I think that's an ROI. That is an immediate return. There's a financial, you could calculate it, which is hard to do with other security things. You also have your base compliance. Look, if we need to get that reporting that Wes was talking about earlier, be able to demonstrate to internal audit and others, external audit, that we've got a process in place, it works. The tool right there will sort of check that box. And then just the general risk management, ability to get some key use cases like deprovisioning of access, dormant accounts, where you knock your risk off substantially right off the bat with a handful of quick win use cases, I think gets you an ROI to at least get started.
Okay, great. Well,
yeah,
go ahead, Wes.
Yeah, go ahead, David. Well, I was just going to say, from my perspective, ROI with all the CISOs I've talked to over the last year or two, ROI is about the third at the highest, the third or fourth thing down that they look at. when looking to try and implement an identity governance system. There's just so much intrinsically fundamental to a CISO's duties in an identity governance system that they really are starting to realize, I have to have this now. And ROI is a secondary consideration.
Okay, well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have today. I want to thank Brian and Keith and Wes once again for today's informative webinar, and want to thank Imprivata for making today's program possible. And finally, I want to thank everyone in the audience for joining us. We hope you'll join us again in the future for another healthcare innovation webinar. So that concludes today's presentation. Thank you very much.
Thanks, David, Keith, Brian. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. Likewise. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
Thanks.